what I'm going to do is kind of give you a little bit of a journey through my science background and how I've got to where I am today. I hope that you'll find it interesting, give you some pointers and hints and tips about how I kind of went about the way that I went about learning about science and becoming a scientist. So at the moment, I'm a reader in cancer cell biology at King's College London, and that picture you can see on the screen there, I'm sure you can recognise that iconic building, which is the Shard, and that little building next door that's also lit up, that's Guy's Hospital, and I work on the Guy's Hospital campus at King's College London. So what do I do on a day-to-day basis? Well, actually, I do a lot of different things, which is actually part of what I love so much about my job is the variety. So I have roles in education and I also have roles in research as well. On the education side, I'm working with some of our undergraduate students. So these are people doing their degrees in things like biomedical sciences. And I also work with medical students as well. So I help to teach both the scientists and the medical students. And as part of that, over the years, I've taken on more and more responsibility. So now I actually lead courses. So I'm called a module lead. And I also work as a tutor as well. So when you go to university, you always have one of the academic staff assigned to you in a more personal tutor role. And I work in that role as well. So on the research side, I run a laboratory. So I'm very much involved in day-to-day, frontline, new research, doing new things in cancer biology. And to do that, I work very closely with my clinical colleagues in the hospital as well. So we have a very active research program, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then in the middle, you'll see that I also have a role to play within the university where I'm the Associate Dean for Doctoral Studies. And that means that in addition to these education and research roles, I also have a very specific responsibility for those students in the university who are doing postgraduate degrees. So that's their PhD. So that's the next step after they've done their degree and when they're really concentrating on research. And I'm responsible for looking after those students and making sure that they have a successful program at the postgraduate level. So quite a lot of different things to do. So how did it all start for me? So here I am. This is me at primary school. You can see that in the 1970s, when I was at primary school, we all wore ties, and they were proper ties that you had to tie yourself. So you can imagine the hassle it was after you had to get dressed after PE. This is my school here. So this was St Mark's Primary School. And my science journey really started here, I think. If I think back to what really first fired my imagination and my interest in science, it's this model here that you can see on the slide. So we used to have one of these models in our science room, and I absolutely loved taking it apart and putting it back together. And I think that's where I really first started to want to understand how the human body works. And really, I've never really lost that. So that's still what I'm trying to do to this day. So that's where it kind of started for me. So after primary school, I went to high school, and here's a picture of my high school here. And it was at high school that I continued my science education, as I'm sure you are doing as well. So at that time, it was O levels, and I did all the science O levels. And then I decided that that was really where my interest lied. So then I went on to do science A levels. So I did biology, loved biology. And to complement that, I also did chemistry, and then I did maths with statistics as well. So I think probably at this point, quite a classic combination of A levels for someone that's thinking about going into a science career. But of those three, the one that I really, really liked the most and did the best in, I would say, was biology. So I was always more inclined towards the biology. So what happened next? Well, I had my science A levels, and then I decided that I would do a degree. And so I needed to choose my degree. And as I've said, I kind of had an interest in biology. And I thought, and this is probably one of the first things that I would like to talk to you about, is I thought I wanted to be a forensic scientist, but I hadn't really given it that much thought at all. And I applied to go to the University of Salford to do biochemistry because I noticed in their booklet that they said that some of their students might get to go on forensic science placements. And I would caution anyone who's thinking about going to university to do more research about the degree program that you decide to do than one sentence in a prospectus booklet. Because when I got to Salford, really liked Salford, hated biochemistry. And that was because there was way too much chemistry for me. And you'll see in year one, organic chemistry. And for those of you that are doing A-levels at the moment and are doing A-level chemistry, organic chemistry was always the hardest bit for me. And I was not super thrilled to find out that I was going to be doing so much chemistry in year one. So I actually took a step back and thought, is this really for me? And I think if I'd looked at it better and read up more on it and thought about it more and talked to people more about it, I would have realized much sooner that this actually wasn't where I needed to be. So it was a real lesson there. But having said that, it does show that you can make changes and turns and twists, and it all kind of works out in the end. So not to panic as well. So what I decided is this wasn't for me. And what I did instead is I went to UCL. And this is one of the universities in London, University College London. And at UCL, I did a traditional biology degree, and it suited me so much better. So it was a really good decision to leave that first degree program and go and do a biology degree. And I think that's really important in life, that you're not afraid to kind of say, hold on a minute, this might not work for me, and take a different direction. So I did the kind of classic things in year one and year two, but it was really in the third year, that final year, where we started to get into the nitty gritty and to get into a bit more detail. And we started to learn more about cells and to do things at the cell level. And this was the bit that I absolutely loved. So I realized that I was going to be a cell biologist. If I was going to do anything, it was going to involve looking at single cells. So just to remind you, I'm sure most of you know this because you're coming from science backgrounds, that cells are the building blocks of our body. They form all of the tissues and organs in our body, and everything that that makes up a human being ultimately comes down to your cells. So I was absolutely fascinated by this. And one of the things that really fired my imagination was some films that I was shown in my third year at university. And I'm going to show you, hopefully now, one of these movies. These films are actually really, really famous. And I didn't know at the time when I was being shown them that the person showing them to me, Joan Haseman, was actually a very famous scientist and one of the first people in the world to ever make films of cells. So what you're going to see are live cells being filmed. It looks very old and very grainy because these films were actually made in the 1960s and 70s. So they're really old, but they were one of the first films ever made. And I didn't realize at the time, but I was actually being taught by people who were spearheading this part of cell biology and were really pioneers in this kind of technology. So if I play this now, hopefully what you'll be able to see is we've got two cells on the screen here, and you can see that they're moving around, and they are moving towards each other, touching each other, moving away from each other. And I was absolutely fascinated by this. So I can still remember the room I was sitting in when I saw these movies for the first time. And I just wanted to be able to do that myself. I wanted to be able to make films of cells myself. So that was really inspiring. So at the end of my degree, and here's me graduating from UCL with my degree in biology, I knew I really liked science. I knew I was really interested in cells, but I wasn't really 100% sure what to do next. And I also knew that I quite liked teaching as well. So I actually went to the University of Sheffield and qualified as a science teacher straight from university. And again, I think what I'd like you to take away from this is that career paths are not always straight. So they meander quite a lot. People do different things, move around, take on different experiences and responsibilities. And everybody's career journey is slightly different. So for me, it was qualifying as a science teacher first at the University of Sheffield. And then I had to make another decision about whether I stayed in teaching or went back and did some more research. And I decided that I'd quite like to do a little bit more research in a lab before thinking about whether I wanted to go and teach in school full time. So I went back to university to do a postgraduate research degree or PhD. And that means that you spend 3 to 4 years in a laboratory doing experiments so that you can write a big book called a thesis at the end. That means that you can qualify as a PhD scientist. And when you qualify, that's when you take on the title doctor. So here are my PhD supervisors, Michelle Peckham and Graham Dunn. And when you do a PhD, it's very different to being doing your undergraduate degree, because you're supervised by 2 people who are really good scientists, and you work in their lab, and they really train you how to be in a laboratory and how to do research experiments. So that's what Michelle and Graham did. And my project for my PhD was to try and understand how muscle is made. So my project was part of a bigger question about how we might help people with muscular dystrophy. And of course, hopefully you've heard of muscular dystrophy and you know that that's a muscle wasting disease. So we wanted to try and understand how muscle was made so we could think about how we could help these people, maybe by helping them to regenerate muscle. So what you can see here are the stages of muscle, so how muscle is made. So it starts off as single cells called myoblasts. Those myoblasts turn into myocytes as they age. They then start to fuse together, and ultimately they fuse into these really long tubes called myotubes. And as these tubes come together and form, eventually that's what makes your muscle fibers. So my job in that PhD was to find out whether a particular protein called a myosin had an important role to play in that muscle development. And of course, my project, which is very much the case in science, was a very small piece of an enormous jigsaw. So each person working in a laboratory, working on a project, is putting in pieces to make this big picture, this big jigsaw of our understanding. So not one person is ever going to solve all of the questions out there. We're all contributing and working together to try and put this picture together. So that was my little piece of that jigsaw, trying to understand how muscle is formed. And here is a publication that I then published from my PhD. So one of the aims in research science is to tell the world about your science and what you've discovered. And we do this through publication. So we're always publishing papers to tell other scientists and non-scientists about the work that we're doing. So this was one of my first ever papers. And you can see I'm the first author because I did the work, and there's my PhD supervisor, Michelle, there. So it went really well and I really enjoyed it. So then I had a decision to make again. Here I am at my PhD graduation. So you can see when you graduate your PhD, you get a nice red coloured gown and you get this big floppy hat to wear because you're a PhD. And that's when you get awarded the title doctor. So after that, there's lots and lots of different things you can do. And we actually need scientists in academia. So we need scientists to carry on teaching younger scientists and doing research. But we actually need scientists everywhere else as well. We need scientists in industry. We need them in government. We need them in journalism, in law, in policy making. So actually, there's a huge world out there of possibilities if you have an interest in science. So it's not restricted to just becoming a university lecturer, teacher, or working in a research lab, there are a huge number of different opportunities to use your science. And so I had to make that decision. I personally decided that I wanted to stay in the lab. So I stayed in the laboratory. I wanted to do more experiments. I wanted to do more research. So I became what we call a postdoctoral scientist. So that's a scientist after you've finished your PhD. And I moved to the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research, which was part of UCL at the time. And this is my supervisor there. This is Professor Anne Ridley. So I moved from muscle into cancer. And the reason I moved from muscle into cancer is what had really inspired me during my PhD and continued to inspire me during my time after PhD was cell motility. So I went right back to those movies that I'd seen when I was at UCL doing my degree, and I wanted to understand more. And of course, movement of cells is really important in the progression of cancer. And it's when cancer cells start to move around the body that we start to see problems and poorer outcomes for our patients. And so I was now studying how these cancer cells that start off in this lump at the beginning, how they actually move out and move away. And that's really been my research question since then. So I've never really moved away from that. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand how these cancer cells are doing that, how they're getting out of that primary lump and moving around the body. And then, of course, trying to think about ways that we could stop that happening. So I did lots of work in Anne's lab, lots more papers, and some of them you can see here. Trained and learned to be a scientist because it's all about training and learning. And also had time to have my first child as well. So this is my daughter, Poppy. Poppy's now in her final year at university, so you can see how long ago that was. And so I managed to balance a research career with having children as well. And I think that's important, that it is possible to do both. So after Anne's lab, I again needed to decide what I was going to do next. And I moved to King's. So this is when I moved to King's. And I moved to King's to work with Professor Gareth Jones. And here's me and Gareth here in front of a poster of our work. I stayed in the field of understanding cancer metastasis, or how cancers spread, but I became a little bit more independent. So I wanted to direct the research a little bit more myself. Really lucky that Gareth was very happy for me to do that. So we did lots of work together, particularly focused on prostate cancer. Still making movies. So really core to what I do is even today, like this week, we've been making movies in my lab. So still making movies of cells. And this one that I'm going to show you here is a movie of cells scattering. So we're interested in modeling that how cells leave the primary tumor and move around the body. And a very simple way, we can see that down the microscope. So if I press this, you can see all the cells flying apart and moving around the plate. And we can use that to think about ways that different drugs we might add to stop that happening. So that's what we're doing in the lab. And I also found time to have my second child, Lola. So this is Lola enjoying the ball pit. And so I had a great time in Gareth's lab, both doing science and having second children. And then it was time for me to really take that next step up. It was time for me to start my own lab. And here I am. I started my lab in 2007, and my lab is still at King's, and it's kind of moved through the ages. So these are pictures of my lab at all different stages. And the one thing you'll notice is the only person that stays constant in a research lab is the head of the lab, because everybody else is on a pathway. So they're either doing PhDs, which take 3 years, or they're doing postdocs that take 3 years. So everybody else is moving through, and you're the only one that stays as a constant. But what that means is you get to meet lots of really amazing people. And we're really proud of the work that we've been doing, and part of the work that we've been doing since I started my lab has actually now turned into a drug discovery program with Cancer Research UK, and we are now developing drugs that we think might be able to stop some of that spread. So it's still very early days, but it's really positive and exciting. So I still kind of come to the lab every day really excited about the science that we're doing. And we've really progressed as well. So now we do 3D models. This is a 3D model of a pancreatic cancer with all sorts of different cell types mixed in there. So the technology grows all the time, and that means that we can do more and more really interesting things. So thinking back to those movies in the 1960s, we've really come on leaps and bounds in the way that we can image these cells. So just coming back to the end, this is the journey that took me to where I am now. These are all the different sorts of things I get to do. And that's one of my favorite things about this job is the variety. So no 2 days are ever the same. And that's just absolutely fantastic. I absolutely love it. And then finally, before I stop and take some questions, of course, I have to say thank you to all the people that do the work in my lab. And here's a new lab picture here. As I said, the lab turns over all the time. These are some of the current lab members here, and they come from all over the world. So Vashini comes from India, Alexandria from the USA, Mafuja from Bangladesh, Valeria from Italy, all over the world. And that's one of the great things about science is all the people that you get to meet and work with. And of course, all of the charities and government that fund our work. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready for questions.